That on? No. Is that- We're out here. So, Oh, hands on. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Right. Not sure actually. It's
Yeah,
warm.
Just getting my coffee.
Uh-huh. You making one for us?
Oh, that's like it comes to the top of my head. Okay, I'm just going to get my coffee.
Morning.
Thank you. The problem with this is that the people at home won't be able to see you and Howard. That's all right. That's a blessing. Okay, we'll just do the live link and then we'll start.
Same.
Okay.
Morning, Brenda.
Good morning.
Just trying to do the live share. I'm just waiting for Julian. He's just making himself a drink. Very kindly made everyone else on. Okay. No, not working. Okay, last week I had my back to Julian Howard, so this week we're retaliating. You'll hear them but not see them. We'll figure out a solution eventually.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just trying to do the live link that's not working. So if it doesn't, we'll just
Oh.
carry on.
If there was a longer lead, the laptop could go down that.
It could. The only thing is I need to be able to move it on. But saying that, I could bring a mouse or something. Okay, we'll try that next week. That's what we'll do. Okay, I'm just trying to share this on Facebook and it's not letting me. Determined not to. Okay, never mind. Fine. We'll share it later. Okay. So, okay, morning all.
Good morning.
Got Julian and Howard here
Morning.
behind me. What we could do actually, let's try this. Let's try this. And if we do that. Do that. There we go. There you can see. Can't see me now. Oh, there you go. Right. Works. More or less. Okay. Right. There we go. See everyone now? Okay. I'll have to look at the screen. That's fine. I can do that. Right. So, just to recap from last week, we had laid down what was required. Joshua told them what to do. And then we started the actual story, verse 12. He gets up early in the morning. People always do things early in the morning, right? We've spoken about this before. Avram did it, rushing to do mitzvahs. And the Kohanim take the ark. We had a question last week, which I haven't actually found an answer to, which was that on the one hand, we said that David HaMelech, even though he was a righteous warrior, there's no suggestion he was immoral, but nonetheless, because he was a warrior, he didn't merit to build the temple. So it seems like there's a connection between shedding blood and sort of purity, and yet the ark was carried into battle. That seems like you would think the ark wouldn't be carried into battle, but it was. So I'm not sure about that. So we had Yehoshua early in the morning, the 7 Kohanim with 7 trumpets, 7 shofars on the 7th day, going around 7 times. See a bit of a theme of 7 here. Interestingly, 7, I think we said last week, is actually the order of nature, although the falling of the walls presumably is not necessarily a natural phenomenon. I know that opera singers can break glass windows and things. I don't know about breaking walls. Anyway, so I think we're up to verse 13. So all fairly predictable. Who'd like to read? How do you want to read? It's on the screen there. If it's bigger, it's easier to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord were going continuously, and they blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets.
Right. Another translation said, I never thought about where this comes from. The vanguard, which obviously must mean the forward guard, and then the rear guard. So the vanguard, it seems, was the 2.5 tribes who had said that they would go into battle ahead of everyone else. Now, just a couple of things before we continue. I don't know where Jericho is in modern practical terms on the map in relation to strategy, but at this time it was essentially a border town. I have a friend whose father lived in the northernmost, what's it, Rosh Hashanah, is it? Rosh Hashanah. And if I recall correctly, various times when there have been rockets, things from Lebanon, it's quite a scary place to live. And if you read some of the Israeli history, I think in Ariel Sharon's book, can everyone hear me okay, by the way, because I'm not right next to the screen?
Yeah.
Great. In Ariel Sharon's biography, it talks about some of the kibbutzim that were founded on borders and things, which, to be quite honest, were basically the first line of defense. And I don't know if people told the families that moved there that essentially they were moving into an outpost. So these were not, I know that unfortunately cities have their share of trouble as well. But in military terms, if you think about, okay, obviously if you have like airstrikes and so on, it's different. But if you think about ground invasions, somewhere like London, for example, actually London is on the coast. Birmingham is right in the middle of the country. So they're going to have to get through other cities before they get to Birmingham. So Jericho was an outpost and a border city. The other thing we have to consider is that we're about to read about the total destruction of Jericho
men, women, and children. You may also be aware, of course, we touched on last week, that King Saul was basically deposed because of his failure to annihilate the entire nation of Amalek. Now, if you can read that without having a slight concern by today's moral standards, then you're probably not paying attention to it, because it's quite gruesome stuff. It's basically ethnic cleansing in a nutshell. So we're going to have to try to explain that at some point as to why they were commanded to do that, so much so that when it comes to, it's a slightly different situation, when it comes to Amalek and what do you call it? And King Saul, that he's actually punished for not destroying the entire nation of Amalek. It's something to think about, especially since the people of Jericho are not necessarily Amalek, as far as we know. Anyway,
Oh, but the justification was that Amalek would always seek to destroy.
that's from Amalek, right? I mean, one of the most unpleasant things that you have to consider is, I'm not advocating, I'm not saying that killing is the answer, but a problem that Israel has to deal with is that you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old children going to terrorist summer camps where they're taught that, you know, jihad is good and suicide bombing is great. And they then grow up with that hatred. You can't erase that through a peace treaty. That is very, you know, it'd be like saying, you know, a bit politically incorrect, but when they had that business a few years ago with the football in the Ukraine, do you remember? And the black footballer was being racially abused. I think it was the European Championships or something. And my first thought was, well, you know, they weren't very nice to us in the 1940s. Why are we assuming that anything has changed? Why would we assume, you know, that people who had a clearly, and Ukrainians were particularly unpleasant from what I recall during the Nazi era. Why would you just assume that that has changed in that national character? Now, maybe it's a very racist thing to say, I don't know. It's a reasonable leap to make. And in fact, one of the problems we see, where you see it even in Russia and certainly in the Middle East, where they've attempted democracy, is that you can't just change people's attitudes overnight. So look what happened in Iraq. America thought they could go in, or Libya, or Afghanistan. You know, what happened in Afghanistan? They're back to where they were before we went to war on their behalf. What's gone wrong? So one thing, presumably, is that it's a process of changing people's attitudes. It takes a generation or two. I mean, we knew a chap called Benjamin Stern that was German. He was a student in Cardiff, and he was quite, you know, he was quite an educated lad. I don't think he was naive, and he always said that he felt that he lived in the one country in Europe that had the lowest, or rather the highest intolerance, the lowest tolerance for anti-Semitism. But whereas we're constantly hearing about, at the time, with, well, not the time, this is like 15 years ago, but you know, you think about what's gone on in the Labour Party, you think about some things that have happened in this country in the last few years, and certainly France, for example. And meanwhile, he was saying at the time, I don't know if it's true now, in Germany, the slightest peep of anti-Semitism would be squashed by the authorities because of the never again mentality. So it was a different take on it. Of people say, well, I never want to live in Germany. Oh, how can anyone go live in Germany? The other way to look at it is that, you know, lightning doesn't strike twice type of mindset, that actually it might be one of the safest countries in Europe. And I'm not sure that's true these days.
No.
There's a lot going on, unfortunately, a lot of anti-Semitism often from other
The
immigrants.
whole of Eastern
Yes.
Germany was
Of course.
the same as it ever was. It was never reconstructed.
Yeah.
And I have the feeling that in West Germany, it's just because there's a
simmering.
state lid on it,
Yes.
and people's attitudes
Yes.
probably haven't changed at
Yes.
all.
It's hard to expect people's attitude to change in one generation. This is one of the challenges. So anyway, but we're about to see the destruction of Jericho, which is slightly more worrying thing, but we'll discuss it. We'll see some of the explanations. Anyway, let's carry on. Right, verse 14. Someone at home want to read?
Do you want something to read?
Yeah, go on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
For number 14.
let's do 14 and 15.
Okay. And the second day they circled the city once and returned to the camp. So they did 6 days. And it was on the 7th day that they rose early at the dawning of the day, and they circled the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they circled the city 7 times.
And like we said, it's like Hoshannahs. I don't know if this is where we get it from. We do 1 for the first 6 days of Sukkot and 7 on the last day. What do you notice about a 7-day period? What's going to happen at some point in 7 days?
The wall falls down.
Has to happen at least once in 7 days.
Shabbos.
Shabbos. So according to Rashi, the seventh day was actually Shabbos. I have no idea how that works. I suppose that when you're in the middle of a military campaign, you're allowed to do certain things on Shabbos, possibly including circling walls and blowing shofars. And we know that there is a malacha, which we haven't yet come to in our Monday morning share, of destroying things. So knocking down walls on Shabbos wouldn't generally be allowed. But I'm guessing it was considered urgent, and it was a war that had been mandated by God. So I guess they're allowed to do it. Anyway, right, let's carry on. Verse 16. Do you want to carry on a bit, Brenda? Go on.
Oh, okay. And it was at the seventh time the priest blew with the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city."
Right. Okay. And finally, let's look at number 17.
And the city shall be devoted, it and all that was in it, to the Lord. Only Rahab and the harlot shall live, she and all that is with her in the house, because she hid the messenger that we sent.
Okay, so before we continue, a couple of issues here. So far, it's basically a rehash of what Joshua commanded, that it's all happened. I presume it was quite an unnerving experience, that all the noise and the shofars, and if anyone's ever heard a building collapse, it's like an explosion. It sounds like a nuclear war. It's a horrible noise. Presumably, it was all quite a shocking experience. In a moment, we're going to talk about the issue of what you're supposed to do when you go to war against the city, because we learn that from the Torah. The city and all shall be devoted to the Lord, meaning what's called a cherem. A cherem is basically the spoils are totally destroyed. I mentioned previously, this is a parallel for the firstborn or the first fruits that are given to God. So the first city, rather than being inhabited, is given to God. Now Rashi says the reason for this is because it's Shabbos, and therefore on Shabbos it makes sense to make things holy to God. But elsewhere it says it's a more fundamental idea. It's just the idea that you call Kodesh Hashem, anything that's first is given to God. Now, I have a question which hasn't been answered. We're told not to shame people, not to embarrass people. Right? You're not supposed to refer to a convert as a convert, even there's nothing wrong with that. I'm surprised that Rachav, when she reappears here, is called Rachav Hazona, which means basically Rachav the prostitute, unequivocally. And she's called that again in a few verses time. And I looked up the various commentaries, and no one seems to have an answer. Oh,
Jericho.
Jericho is. It's on the board or something.
Yes. It's quite near the River Jordan.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
It's just over.
Where the flag is. Right, so Jericho's a border town, yes. Julian has just very helpfully found a map. Also, in Israel, the border is so narrow, the country's so narrow, that it's not hard to be a border town, honestly. That's another story. She's called Rachav Hazona. I'm not sure why, because that seems like a bit of a put down, but she's referred to in that way a couple of times. What's even more surprising is that she's referred to that way, even though, if you recall, we touched on the fact that there are those who say she was so impressed by the saintliness of the two spies that they didn't succumb to her charms, that some say she even converted to Judaism. I believe that some say she may have even married Joshua.
But maybe they refer to her as that because it was a perfectly legitimate occupation then.
No worse than innkeeper.
Yes.
Possibly same thing.
I don't know. It gives weight to all those people that say that there's, as long as you're not married, there's no prohibition against two single people hooking up, which is an interesting one. It's an interesting point of great debate. It's not considered very moral. You're supposed to get married, but we know that if two people have a child out of wedlock when neither is married and they could legally get married, then that's not actually considered a mamzer. So it's an interesting one. And since the dawn of time, I mean, you had what was called the, what was it called? Concubine, what was it called in Hebrew? I can't think of the word. There's a word for a concubine in Hebrew. Anyway, you have this basic idea somehow that it was acceptable to have these dalliances. So you might be right, but it's a couple of things. There's a suggestion that she was so impressed by their, I guess most people couldn't resist her charms, and they resisted her charms, and she was so taken with this that she said, you know, what is it that inspires these people to be so moral? And oh, it's their Judaism. Oh, I think I'll convert. And I think there's even a version that she married Yeshua. I don't know if that's correct or not. The other interesting thing is in the Hebrew, the word it uses for the messengers is malachim, which means angels. And the reason for that, the commentaries say, is because basically they withstood her professional advances. I don't know if she specifically put herself out there, but I guess most men that encountered her generally expected to have some kind of relationship, and Yoshua and Kalev were oblivious to that. So they're called malachim. It's interesting, you know, just to digress for a moment, there's been, people are following all the news, but there's been this very tragic case of this, this author in Israel that we don't say committed anymore, took his own life, Chaim Walder, who abused, allegedly, but very clearly a lot of evidence, abused a number of people, both seems men, women, and children, and took advantage of his position. And one of the things that's being discussed a lot in rabbinic circles is basically the idea. It says in the Gemara, "Ein apotropos la'arayos." Apotropos means a guardian. Because when it comes to illicit relationships, basically you can't trust yourself. And a lot of problems start when a person thinks that because they've reached a certain position of power or authority, that people will trust them and they don't need the same safeguards in place, right? I'm the CEO, so I can sign the checks. I don't need a second signatory. I'm whatever, a therapist, a teacher, a head teacher, a rabbi, or whatever. I would never slip and fall. I don't need to have the door open when I'm teaching a bar mitzvah boy. I don't need to keep the laws of Yichud where you're not supposed to be alone with somebody else. I don't need all that because obviously everyone knows I'm a very holy person, and it could be that people even see the person in that way, and that's when the trouble starts. The trouble starts when you have too much faith in yourself, and you might say, well, but a normal person surely isn't going to be tempted by, temptation is a very powerful thing, and we see this from this, that these two spies that went to this inn, which was also a brothel, they could easily have, while they were there, made use of the services available, and the fact that they didn't, they're called malachim, they're called angels, because we recognize that the fragility of the human condition, and it's no accident that we talk about crimes of passion, things done in the heat of the moment, which often involve love and romance and well, maybe not love, lust. Crimes of passion often involve some kind of illicit relationship somewhere along the line. And you ask yourself, why would people do that? Why would somebody throw away, I don't know, 20 years of marriage for one night, whatever, but it's happened throughout history. It's one of the most basic human instincts, particularly amongst men. So they are called malachim because they resisted her charms. Right now, of course, in reality, she was a very righteous lady. She put herself at risk. You're going to say to me, she put herself at risk because they promised her safe passage. Interesting question. Whose obligation was it to protect Rachav? Who made the promise to her? Sorry, I said Yoshua Kalev. It wasn't. It was Kalev and Pinchas, wasn't it? Yeah. Who made the promise to her?
I did.
Right. In whose name?
Can't remember.
The commentaries discuss this. They basically made a personal promise to her. That if you don't, if you don't rat us out, then we will protect you when we come and take over the city. Now, that's not to say that Yoshua and the nation of Israel didn't have to honor that, but it's just a little technicality.
They're two leading.
They were, and it's a bit like, a bit like someone saying, I promise you immunity from prosecution, and saying, oh well, I forgot to check with my boss. Or wait a minute, surely that's on you. So there's no suggestion that anyone should have put her at risk. But just to note, the promise was made by the two spies, presumably acting on behalf of Yeshua, but nonetheless it was made by them. So if something happened to them, I presume they went home and told Yeshua what had happened. In reality, of course, she was spared. And that's the command that was given. The city shall be devoted to the Lord. Only Rachav and her household will live because she hid the messengers. Now it's going to get a bit ugly. Okay. Julian, you want to read number 18?
Yep. And only you keep yourselves from the devoted thing, lest you make yourselves condemned when you take of the devoted thing and make the camp of Israel a ruin and trouble it.
This is a strange translation.
That means stay away from
the spoils. We're going to see later on people get in trouble when they go and take spoils when they shouldn't. If anyone knows the rest, I don't want to give spoilers, quite literally, But later on with I, that's what happens, and somebody takes something they shouldn't. Take of the spoils of war is something that we are given specific commandments about. I think it's in Parshas Matos Masai. But to just go and grab is considered very bad form, especially since we said the entire city will be devoted to Hashem and basically never rebuilt. We're going to see that in a minute. So he says that you should keep yourselves from the strange translation. The cherem is the Hebrew phrase, right? You're probably familiar with the word cherem, either because you may have heard the word cherem in relation to excommunication. So a person put in cherem was sent to Coventry, as it were. The truth is that if a Beis Din, for example, the one we're probably most aware of is someone who refuses to give a get to his wife, where there's a legitimate cause to do so. I say that as a rider because you can have a situation. I was involved in a situation once, cut a very long story short, a prominent member of the community at the time, not here, was in one of my previous communities. I get a call from the ex-wife saying, I see that my ex-husband is being honored with whatever it was, chassan Torah or something, I don't remember at the time. And are you aware that he's refusing to give me a get and I'm an agonah and you should not be honoring him? What do you do? I phoned the Beis Din and had a long discussion. We did some research. I was advised to check with him and I had a very honest conversation with him. He sent me some paperwork from the Jerusalem Beis Din, which said in black and white that he had appeared at the Beis Din willing to give a get and the ex-wife had failed to appear and she was holding out. So there was definitely a situation there. I'm not saying he was in the right, but that definitely doesn't constitute an agonah where somebody's gone to a Beis Din ready to carry out the get process. So she was the one delaying it. So to start sanctioning him would have been a little bit. So we assume always that the husband is in the wrong, not always. But so the truth is there, when a Beis Din say that Mr. So-and-so, you shouldn't count him in a minion and you shouldn't patronize his business and whatever, you should treat him like a person non grata, the initial phrase for that is usually nidui, which means they're being judged, like related to a din, I think. No, it's not. Not sure the root. It's a status of nidui, which means somebody is refusing to come to Beis Din.
Sounds a bit like vidui.
I don't think it's related. I'm just wondering what the root is. I'm not sure what the root. No, I'm not sure what the root is. But nidui, related to nida, meaning sort of, impure and unclean. Not sure actually. But nidui is the status of someone who refuses to go to Beis Din, who's basically, rejects a subpoena, who's in contempt of court, if you like. And the next stage would be cherem, which is a formal excommunication. The other time you come across the word cherem is, for example, the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon, which is basically a prohibition against marrying more than one wife or opening other people's mail. People say, by the way, Rabbeinu Gershon lived about 1,000 years ago. Some say it's expired now. So Ashkenazim only ever married one wife. Sephardim were never accepted this. I believe there were Sephardim that married more than one wife, even a few hundred years ago. Rabbeinu Gershon is connected to the word Gerusha, which means divorce. Some people say that maybe if he was divorced, and maybe that's why he said you shouldn't marry more than one wife, because he had a bad experience, and also that looking at other people's mail is probably connected to marriage problems as well. But anyway, he said you shouldn't read people's mail.
Cherem and living in somewhere
Right.
like
I was
York.
going to say the other one is the cherem of not living in York. So a cherem is like a ban, basically a ban. So cherem here is banned items. Why are they banned? Because they were basically to be left in the city and burned. I know it's not very ecological, but all given to Hashem, spoils of war. Okay, that's fine. I mean, whatever. That we find that in different places. And we're told that if you take the spoils, it will actually be destructive to you. It will have a negative impact. So far, that's not too controversial. Okay, verse 19, Pam, do you want to read?
Oh, and all the silver and gold and vessels of copper and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord.
So you're not allowed to take personal spoils, but the precious metals are given to God. Now, I can't tell you what other spoils there will be besides that. I'm thinking livestock.
Yeah.
We'll see. Okay. So what happened next?
I carry on.
Yeah.
And the people shouted, and the priests blew with the trumpets. And it was when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down in its place. And the people went up into the city, every man opposite him, and they took the city.
Okay, let's do 21.
Pardon, carry on, did you say?
Yeah, sorry, the bottom line's missing, but you can probably see it.
Oh, hang on, just a minute. I can only see one line because
Oh, I'll do it.
No.
And they completely destroyed all that was in the city, man and woman, young and old, ox, sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. Okay, we're going to have to look at this. Before we do that, question, how's Rachav going to get saved if the walls of the city come tumbling down? Anyone remember where
She's either in the
her,
wall of the
right,
city.
her inn was basically straddling the border, if you recall. That's how they were able to escape. So I guess, I think the commentaries say that at least the part that was outside the walls was intact. What does the Torah tell us you're supposed to do when you come to a city to make war? What's the first thing you're supposed to do?
Speak to them.
Yes, and sue for peace, as they say. Right?
Talk to them.
You're supposed to try to make peace, and only if they won't make peace do you then flex your muscles. No peacemaking has taken place here. Right? They simply go in, they destroy everyone. It's a massacre, basically. So how to explain it? So a few of the different shurim I've listened to on this, they start with a disclaimer that some things you're going to read about don't sit very well with modern understanding of morality, and just, you know, a trigger warning, as they say nowadays. But how do we explain it? With Amalek, at least we understand that they were considered an evil nation through and through, and there was no redemption, and therefore they had to be destroyed. What did the people of Jericho do wrong? Why was there no attempt? Rachav had told them that the people were frightened of them even. Troubling, right?
Is it to send out a signal to the rest of the land?
Well, it could be because it was a border town, right? So also there's a suggestion that the people living there might have been primarily military, possibly.
Does mention men, women, and young and old.
Yes. There's another explanation. I mean, by the way, look, it's not so long ago that this country, okay, now they talk about targeted strikes. I mean, World War II, you had carpet bombing, it wasn't targeted strikes. Whole cities were, whole neighborhoods were destroyed, including the people in them. Unfortunately, it's been a feature of warfare since time immemorial. But here God himself is telling, it sounds very harsh. So one of the details that's missing is who were these people? They were Canaanites, right? So previously, you might recall a few places in the Torah, it says in the Chumash, you know, the immoral practices of the Canaanite nations. Don't be like the evil Canaanite nations. It talks about their immoral practices, like their sacrificing their children to Molech and things like that. So some of the commentaries say you have to remember that these were nations that had already been condemned for their barbaric, immoral behavior. So they weren't saints in the first place. I still don't know how that would justify the killing of everybody. But that is one of the suggestions, that remember who these people were. They were an already tainted nation that had been called out for their immorality and their barbaric behavior, like sacrificing their children to this god Molech and things like that. It's one of the explanations given. Another explanation is it was a border town, as Julian said, it's an unfortunate feature of war. There's a question there, definitely, why they didn't go through the process that the Torah tells us, which is that you initially try to make peace, right? Including if you're trying to conquer somewhere. You know, the people have a choice to give up, basically. All the indications were that people were afraid of the Israelites. That's what we're told by Rachav. That's what she tells the two spies. So it's a little problematic. Tanakh is full of this stuff. Our history is full of this stuff. But you know, our modern understanding is very different. And as we said, with King Saul, he was even deposed because of, what was it? He left one sheep alive, I think it was, a donkey, wasn't it?
And the king.
And the king, yes. Which, by the way, you have precedent for that as well. I think, well, Pharaoh was left alive, right? To see the destruction. You know, it's often the act of not killing the king, but letting them see the destruction of everything else is often an act of, I suppose, rubbing their nose in it almost. So it's not totally resolved, but the entire place had to be destroyed. The entire place was basically, what's the phrase, razed to the ground. And as I said last week, we'll see in a moment, it was, we may not have time actually, it might be a cliffhanger, but it's never rebuilt. And this is why Gaza and Jericho first wasn't particularly contentious. If they'd said, you know, I don't know, I'm trying to think of somewhere in the West Bank, Gaza and Efrat first, or Gaza and Hebron first, that would have been much more controversial. Jericho, I don't think there are any shuls. I think there may have been one old shul in Jericho. There was no Jewish settlement in Jericho. It's the only place in the West Bank with no Jewish settlement. I believe that's why, because we've just seen it's the first place that was conquered and it was permanently left as a monument. The Americans will argue that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was an act that ultimately ended the war, even though, as
Preventing more.
Iran
deaths.
is very fond of reminding us, the only nation that's ever actually used a nuclear bomb. It's the one that's telling everyone else what they should do, which is America. They'll say it prevented more deaths, but of course it was horrific. So you could possibly apply the same logic here, that whilst tragic, it ultimately presumably meant that the rest of the conquest of the land was probably quite easy. Now, I don't know if they destroyed any other cities. I'm not sure they did. It's just Jericho, I think, you'll find. It's a far cry from modern warfare where collateral damage is a much bigger factor. We know that the IDF often go to great lengths, despite what other media might say about them, they do go to great lengths to prevent civilian casualties. It's an ethical issue that is argued, they possibly go too far. It's debatable whether you have to put your own troops at risk of their own life to protect civilians living in a war zone. It's one thing to say that you're not allowed to target civilians and you have to try to preserve civilian life. It's quite another to say that, you know, that the soldiers themselves should be put at greater risk. I don't think any country in the world besides Israel does that. And it's a moral debate as to whether it's actually the right thing to do. Ironically, they get no credit for it. The famous blood libel about, what was it, in Jenin a couple of years ago.
Fiction.
Anyone knows anything about the IDF, it's the exact opposite. They go knocking on doors at great risk themselves rather than just blasting a whole lot to the ground, because there are innocent civilians there. The other thing is, I don't know what they would have done in Jericho, but of course, in modern times, you have, for example, the Americans and the Israelis will drop leaflets, or they say they phone people. I don't know how they do that. They phone everyone and say, we're about to drop bombs.
Send text messages.
Yeah, send text messages.
They
So,
send dummy bombs.
I mean, I always wonder why if you're-
knock on the door.
right, I always wonder why if you're a terrorist, you don't think, well, I'll leave town. But maybe terrorists are very stubborn. So at some point, if you've had a message saying, get out of town now, and you don't, then arguably you're fair game. I don't know if anyone fled Jericho, by the way. We're not told. You might recall the city was gated to keep the Israelites out. So quite possibly not. But it's definitely a difficult passage. You could say it was different times, but God himself tells them to destroy the whole city. It seems difficult. You should find it difficult. Anyway, I have to go in a minute. Let's see how much more we've got. Well, let's just finish up. I don't think there's too much comment on the next part. How do you want to read number 22? Maybe 22 and 23. How's that?
And to the two men who had spied out the country, Joshua said, go into the harlot's house and bring out from there the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her.
So here's the clue, right? He says, go on, you're the ones that promised her, you go and find her. I don't know if that was, it's your mess, you get yourselves out of it, or if it was more, you should make good on your promise so that she should see that you're men of honor. But anyway, they were sent to do it. Go on in 23.
And the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all that she had. And they brought out all her families and placed them outside the camp of Israel.
I don't know how young they can have been if it was Pinchas and Caleb. They weren't that young. Been around for a while.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Pinchas in particular.
Yeah. It's like when we talk about, girls and they mean people in their 80s and things like that. Okay, so they went in, they brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, everything of hers, all of her families, and placed them outside the camp of Israel. By the way, we assume that people follow their parents' footsteps, I guess. It's not always the case, of course. But you know, if the concern is the morality of the Canaanites, then the fact that their mother, although being, you know, here you have a classic thing, you know, it's like Schindler. They say that Schindler, not Rabbi Schindler, Oscar Schindler, was a womanizer and an alcoholic, and you know, but he saved a lot of Jews, you know, and then you know, Hitler was a vegetarian who made the trains run on time. So which would you prefer? So sometimes, you know, Trump was a megalomaniac, but he was good for Israel. So, you know, sometimes people are not the most moral characters, but they have redeeming features. So she may have been an innkeeper in the looser sense of the word, but she saved us, basically. She saved these two men. I'll take that over some cultured, you know, Eton educated, whatever, you know, member of
Chief
parliament. Huh?
Chief Whip.
Yeah, chief whip any day, you know. So we say often that personal morality is important, but you know, from the other side, sometimes, you know, by your deeds you shall be judged. I think that's a Jewish phrase. Might be a Christian phrase, but anyway, it makes sense in Judaism as well. So in her merit, her entire family is saved. So no, there's no concern that they might all be Canaanite, immoral Canaanites. And interestingly, she was immoral, and yet her loyalty takes precedence.
There's plenty of other Canaanites that are going to remain in the land.
Yes, that's true as
over
well.
the course of the conquest.
Right. And they burnt the city with fire, all that was in it, only the silver and gold and copper and iron they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. So it was basically burnt to the ground. And I'll just finish off quickly. But Rachav, the harlot, and her father's household, more she had Joshua, now it says him, saved alive. She dwelt in the midst of Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom he sent to spy out Jericho. Now, this is where it says she dwelt in the midst of Israel. Commentaries say that this is an allusion that she basically joined the Jewish people and converted. I
Yeah,
don't
because
know.
when she was brought out, she was put outside the camp. So by now she's in the camp.
Yes. So they say that there's a debate as to what point she might have converted, but this is the suggestion she joined the nation of Israel and eventually became in the midst of the nation, suggests that she converted. Right? She also would have been a great military asset, because if you recall, we said previously, she was quite a high-class escort, and probably a lot of the political and military leadership would have crossed her threshold. So she probably had a lot of good information, right? A bit of a honey trap sort of thing. And finally, Joshua adjured them at this time. He said to them, promise me, cursed be the man before the Lord that rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he shall lay its foundation, and the loss of his youngest son, he shall set up its gates. In other words, basically, he'll lose all his children. That's pretty horrible stuff. So basically, do not rebuild Jericho, ever. And so the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was throughout the entire land. Fame or infame, I'm not sure, but it's fame. So as I said, that's why, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been a serious effort to build or sack Jericho by Jewish people. Obviously, the Palestinians did at some point. But if you look at the history of it, I believe that was like later on, a few centuries later. So that was because, according to Rashi, because of Shabbos, but that seems quite a big leap, but Rashi says that, and according to others, simply because it's the first place they came across. Like everything else, the first is consecrated to God. Why you have to burn it to the ground, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a burnt offering, basically. So, lots to digest. Definitely questions around genocide, which is going to reoccur later on in Tanakh, so I hope you've all got a strong stomach. And we will pause there. So we'll finish chapter 6. So thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Sorry
you.
you can't see me, but at least you can see Julian and Howard.
Yes, well, they're the better ones, yeah.
Well, right, so I finally worked this out. Next week I'll bring a cordless mouse and then I can just move the PowerPoint on. Right, gonna sign off. Have a nice Sunday, everyone.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
you
See
too.
you tomorrow
Good
morning.
Thank you for
day.
joining us.
Bye.
Right,
Bye.
bye.